Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a bittersweet gathering, as you know. This is as you may not know. You will know imminently. This will be the final Clark lecture of this semester. So I want to thank you all for your stalwart support. Was that Clark lecture? Not the. Don't take it personally. Michael Hawley, of course, will get the Clark Professor lecture Tuesday, May 5th, 2 weeks from today. Not in this. Is it in this space? You should probably figure out where it is before it happens. But 2 weeks before today, somewhere nearby. But tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our final Clark Fellow lecturer of the semester, Katrin Müller, who comes to us from Goethe University in Frankfurt. She's the author of Visual Interpretation, Astronomical, and Cosmological Diagrams in Manuscripts of the High Middle Ages, which appeared in 2008 as a volume in the highly renowned Historical Semantics series, which comes out of Göttingen. This book takes seriously the kind of schematic materials that art historians tend to avoid. Katrin is a believer in the aesthetic potential of any image to serve as a visual system in its own right, to be what she might call an epistemological figure. One also sees this conviction reflected in Katrin's more recent essays and articles, which span an astonishingly wide spectrum. In this work, Katrin is concerned to understand how images generate knowledge, not only in the High Middle Ages, but also in the 17th century, as well as to expand our comprehension of narrative structure in 12th and 13th century picture cycles, in particular the theological implications. Katrin is also a student of the historiographies of formalism and modernism, an interest seen in her work on Theodor Hetzer and his theory of ornament, and carried over into the work that she's undertaking this semester as a Clark Fellow, from which this evening's lecture comes. That's correct? Not quite. To which this lecture bears some vague and inexplicable relation about which we might hear after this evening's talk. This new project, about which we will hear nothing in foregoing, looks at the textile arts, long considered peripheral to the kinds of objects that serious art history takes up. Ornamental Italian silks of the 14th and 15th centuries provide the focus of this work, which Katrin organizes around key questions concerning the aesthetic experience of nature, the status of naturalism, and other issues arising from the period of transition from the late Middle Ages to the early modern period. Katrin has titled her lecture for this evening, No Easy Prey, Animals in 14th and 15th Century Italian Art. Please welcome her.
Well, thank you, Darby. Before I start, I wish to thank Darby and everybody from the research and academic program for the fellowship. It is a great honor for me to be a fellow at the Clark and to give this lecture tonight. As I am the last fellow in this series of lectures, also on behalf of my fellow fellows, I would like to thank everybody at RAP and from the Clark for taking care of us in such a generous and helpful way, and for creating a productive and stimulating working atmosphere. Special thanks go to Betsy McCormick, Deborah Fair, as well as Karen Bucky and Valerie Crow, and their team at the library, and last but not least, Kristen Lafleur, the housekeeper of our visiting scholars residence. We have been asked many times how, if at all, we managed to do our research now that the Manton building is closed. I have to admit that as I don't know the Manton, I don't know what I'm missing. However, I am convinced that even under these unusual circumstances, as Clark Fellows, we still inhabit the best of all possible worlds. Tonight I'm going to present you some material from the middle section of my book project. It's the section that is not concerned with textile patterns. Although the whole book is largely about silk patterns. It is just the section that I'm working on now while I'm here at the Clark. Okay. Can you hear me well enough when I'm speaking Greek? The Psalter of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the first Duke of Milan, is a particularly splendid example of late medieval illumination. Its miniatures are attributed to Giovannino de' Grassi and dated to around 1390. Giovannino devoted special attention to the design of the pages' borders, which provide an ornamental as well as scenic frame for the text and miniatures in the centers. As seen on folio 115 recto, this framework frequently serves as a forum for the multiple representation of the owner. Here, the psalm, "My soul faints for the salvation," begins with an initial encompassing the enthroned David. Beneath the text, we find a profile portrait of Gian Galeazzo Visconti framed by a band of clouds as well as lambent and linear gold rays. The motive of the radiant sun, Gian Galeazzo's personal impresa, appears over and over in the borders in varying forms. In this folio, it turns up again at the apex, where it is combined with the words "à droit," an abbreviation of the Duke's motto "à bon droit," which means rightfully. At the bottom left, unaware of Gian Galeazzo's presence but nevertheless bathed in his light, 3 hounds stalk a herd of stags occupying the stepped terrain to the right of the profile portrait. In a sense, this small scene is an expansion of the portrait. After all, Gian Galeazzo was an enthusiastic hunter who had large hunting grounds at his disposal at his castello in Pavia, his favorite residence. A conspicuous feature of the depiction of animals in the bas de page, the lower margin, is the absence of opaque paint. With their fine dots and dashes, for example in the deer hide, white heightening in the dog's muzzles, and contour lines, the animals remain in the drawing mode in an environment otherwise characterized by rich use of opaque paint and gold leaf. This is not true of all animals on the Psalter's borders, but to a special degree of the strongly faded birds of prey flanking the beginning of Psalm 109, "The Lord said unto my Lord, sit you at my right hand." The birds are identifiable as animals tamed for falconry by the small bells, difficult to see here, above their feet, and thus again bear a relation to Gian Galeazzo, who appears as before in a portrait at the bottom. The execution in the drawing medium reinforces the link between the animals in the Psalter and those in the famous Taccuino, the sketchbook in Bergamo containing drawings by Giovannino, his workshop, and a later anonymous hand. Giovannino's animal drawings are among the earliest surviving examples documenting a new artistic interest in the depiction of animals in as naturalistic a manner as possible. The resemblance, the falcon on the right of the Psalter, so this falcon and this one, bears to its fellow member of the species in the Taccuino, labeled a falcone by a 16th century hand, and even more so the reappearance of 2 individual stags from the Taccuino in the small herd on folio 115 recto, make a common workshop origin of the sketchbook and the Psalter seem highly plausible. At the same time, the comparison brings out a special characteristic of the depiction in the bas de page. In a spatially cohesive scene, the isolation of the animals has been abandoned in favor of their integration into a small collective. Within this context, the radiant portrait functions as a formal element that, rather than obscuring the spatial continuum, permits an allusion to spatial expansion. Somewhere behind the portrait, the hound's grassy terrain evidently makes a transition to the stag's blue surroundings, and somewhere there, a deepening of the space must also take place. After all, the stags must be farther back in space than the hounds, because otherwise the latter would be nearly as large as the former. The animals' coexistence in the scene and their relationship to one another are matters moreover addressed by their arrangement and the directions they face. Whereas the hounds, the erect standing alound with its head stretched forward and the hounds peering out from their hiding place behind a rock, are keenly aware of the stags, the latter make a carefree impression. Yet each of the two groups can also be contemplated in their own right. The beholder will notice, on the one hand, the hound's good upbringing. They suppress their urge to attack, even though the game is in plain view. And on the other hand, the stag's behavior as herd animals, illustrated in various poses. All in all, the depiction encompasses various aspects of hunting that may go unheeded if the scene is understood merely in its representative function. The spatial ambiguity, the nearness of the hounds, the distance of the stags, which at the same time appear close by, correspond with the constant oscillation between closing in and distancing, between the pursuit of the scent and its loss, that constitute the special appeal of the hunt. What is more, the depiction illustrates the fact that hunting goes hand in hand with specific forms of animal observation. The hounds appear here as inner pictorial viewers. They are not shown in a moment of chasing the game, as in this drawing in Paris attributed to Michelino da Risotto, but waiting and watching. The gaze thus encounters not the fleeing stags, but can linger with the herd and immerse itself in observations of the group life of the species. This attentiveness corresponds to the manner in which contemporary hunting treatises view the game. The writings clearly convey the message that, to hunt successfully, one must study the animals carefully and possess comprehensive knowledge of them. In my talk, I will take a closer look at this interest in the animal from the perspective of the hunt, and the extent to which, in the words of the historian Thomas Elson, I quote him, elite hunting was the medium through which images of nature were fashioned and projected, end of quote. That is, the extent to which hunting encouraged specific ways of perceiving and depicting animals. As is well known, this pastime, so highly prized by the nobility, became a chief subject in the works executed by Giovannino de' Grassi in the courtly context and by his counterparts of the two following generations, Michelino da Risotto and Antonio Pisanello. Depictions related to hunting have provided clues for determining the aims of the patrons with regard to conveying their status, and pointers to the choice of species depicted, as well as to the availability of animal models, live or dead, for the artists. To date, the shift towards naturalism in the depiction of the animal models has been understood in three ways. Firstly, as manifestation of a genuinely and emancipatory artistic concern. Secondly, as achievement in the continuous history of knowledge. Thirdly, as response to humanist discourses about art. According to the first approach, the naturalistic ambitions of Italian artists from the late 14th and first half of the 15th century can be directly related to a claim made by the painter Cennino Cennini in his book of the art, Libro dell'arte, written at the court of the Carrara in Padua at the end of the 14th century. Cennini asked his reader to, I quote him, draw animals as frequently as you can from nature, and this requires much practice. The Italian reads, ritrarne e disegna più che poi dal naturale e ciò ha buona pratica. He gave a specific reason for this naturalistic turn, arguing that the bodies of animals, unlike the male human body, lacked rational proportions and could thus not be grasped theoretically. However, Giannini stressed the importance of first-hand studies of nature throughout his book and spoke of the, quote, triumphal gateway of drawing from nature, la triunfal porta del ritrarre del naturale. Being aware of it or not, artists such as Giovannino and Pisanello seem to have put this claim into practice. The reference to Giannini's Libro dell'Arte, however, does not prove helpful for understanding the specificity of the drawings, that is, the many decisions the artists had to make both when handling and arranging the bodies of the animals and when depicting it. What if this turn of attention to real natural objects was not the result of a genuine artistic reorientation, but a response to an impulse from the outside, and this also in Giannini's treatise? Already Otto Pecht voiced this opinion in the 1950s, and he developed his very influential hypothesis on the emergence of the artistic study of nature in late 14th century Italy. Attributing the reorientation to the courtly context, Pecht described a scenario in which artists were inspired by progress in the scholarly study of nature. The development of empirical science, he speculated, was mirrored in exemplary manner in illumination, specifically in the depiction of plants. There is no question as to the appeal of this analogy. At the end of the Trecento, the illuminator of the Herbario Carrarese took a dried sample of a plant, here a lentil plant, as his model at the court of, again, the Carrara in Padua, and placed his depiction on the page in such a way that we still think we see the actual sample lying there today. In a similar manner, an artist such as Michelino or Pisanello arranged a dead animal, for example, a wolf, for his drawing and then concentrated on the precise reproduction of its outward appearance. It must be questioned, however, whether in their object status for the artists, plants and animals can be equated without further ado, because the effect it cost to obtain an animal will have been far greater than the walk through a garden and the employment of a garden knife. The wolf had to be tracked, chased or lured into a trap and killed. The death of the wretched livestock thief triggered emotions such as gratification, relief, or triumph. There would have had to be an argument that this sample was for the artist so that the cadaver and the artist would come together in a certain place. Finally, the artist would have found himself confronted with an animal in a changed state, and the question of what was to be demonstrated by the drawing required further decisions. If the animal was to be shown lying lifelessly on its side, like this emaciated greyhound, presumably drawn by Pisanello, the artist had to invest far greater effort into arranging the animal's body than it took to arrange a plant sample. Poses were frequently constructed in which the animal looked alive, standing, leaping, or lying erect, like this wild sow hunting leopard and fox. These drawings are all in the Louvre and sometimes attributed to Michelino and sometimes to Pisanello. This changes constantly. Since Michael Baxendel's studies on humanist praise of artists it has been possible to relate the effort to achieve a lifelike impression, more specifically to the appreciation Michelino and Pisanello enjoyed among their contemporaries. Circumstances of this kind are presumed to apply particularly to Pisanello's painting of Saint Eustache in London, dating from around 1438 to 42. Aware of the pleasure humanist viewers took in the depiction of natural objects in such a way as to animate the senses, Pisanello presumably directed his efforts at making his work appear to contain the breaths of the animals and their need for movement, the song of the birds, but also the fragrance of the flowers, the rushing of the river, and the cool of the forest air. It is conspicuous how two appropriations of nature thus overlap in Pisanello's works. On the one hand, the experience of nature capable of refreshing the soul but not straining it, as mirrored in the humanist's ekphrastic exercises, and on the other hand, the lordly pleasure taken in the hunt with its many exertions, its suspense and conflicts, and the promise of trophies. In the following, I will examine the idea that the hunt did not merely provide artists with motives and models, but to an equal degree contributed to the aesthetic of the animal depiction. The artist's special talents in this area of depiction jibed advantageously with the inclinations and interests of their patrons at the courts of Milan and, in the case of Pisanello, Mantua, Ferrara, or Naples. The chivalric courtly hunt had already developed in the High Middle Ages as a special privilege and pastime of nobility. It was not until the later Middle Ages, however, that pragmatic literature on hunting was produced and known on a broad scale. Old French hunting books of the 14th century provide information about the conceptions and practices of hunting popular at the courts of Europe. Among the most extensive and most well-known works were Henri de Ferrière's Book of the Pleasures of the Hunt, Livre des Déduits, written in the mid-14th century, and Gaston Phébus' Book of the Hunt, Livre de Chasse, penned in 1387-89 with knowledge of Henri de Ferrière's treatise. And in the following, we will direct our attention primarily to the treatise by Gaston Phébus, Count of Foix, in the northern slopes of the Pyrenees. The miniatures I will be showing you date from the early 15th century. The hunt made Gaston an especially happy person. For one thing, he considered it a means of protecting himself from idleness and thus from sinful behavior. Far more importantly, however, it was the experience of nature that gave Gaston great pleasure. Now I will show you, he announces in the prologue, that hunters live happier lives, plus joyeusement, in this world than other people, because when the hunter rises in the morning, he sees the very delicate and beautiful morning as well as the clear and calm weather. He hears the song of the birds that call gently, melodiously, and sweetly, each in its own language as well as they can in the way nature enables them." End of quote. Here, the hunter's mild enjoyment of nature still resembles that of the humanist. Gaston, however, goes through the entire course of the day according to its moments of happiness, inevitably arriving at the many joyful events of the hunt. Gaston cites the most prestigious type of hunting, the stag chase, as an example. It comprises the following moments, quote, "And then when all the hounds are in front of him, the hunter will follow close behind them on his steed and blow his bugle as hard as he can. As he does, he will feel great joy and great pleasure. grande joie et grand plaisir, and I promise you that he will not think of anything sinful or bad. When the stag has been vanquished and brought to bay by the hounds, the hunter will have great enjoyment, plaisance, and when he subsequently skins and disembowels the slain stag and prepares the pieces for the hounds, his pleasure, plaisir, is also great. End of quote. If this guarantee of joy in the prologue seems surprising, we learn when we read the body of the treatise that the enjoyment is subject to certain conditions and only results from the knowledgeable practice of the hunt. The pleasure of the hunt is pleasure derived from the sense of accomplishment that comes from possessing specialized knowledge and applying it cleverly. What animal is hunted at what time of the year and by what means? Where can it be found? What types of hounds are used and how are they to be handled? Or what kind of trap might be effective? The most important thing is to assess the animal's behavior correctly. Gaston accordingly begins his treatise by setting forth the characteristics of the game: the stag, fallow deer, he-goat, hare, rabbit, bear, wild boar, fox, badger, wildcat, and otter. He describes the rutting season, the development of the young, pack formation, threatening, attack and flight behavior, but also the animal's appearance, for example, the different types of hide and antlers. Another aspect, very clearly spelled out, is the image of the lives of the animals in the wild, far from human beings and thus only partially inferable. Thus, the overall conception of the animal is assembled from various different components. Part of what accounts for the diversity of the knowledge compiled in the treatise is the fact that it was derived from theory as well as practice. On the one hand, it had its origins in the tradition of zoological writings of the Middle Ages. On the other hand, it drew on observations made in the context of the actual hunt. The recourse to experience is especially significant in the chapters in which Gaston gives instructions for how to become a good hunter. A boy should already learn how to find and follow a scent with his dog at the age of 7, and to recognize the royal stag from its tracks, its droppings, and the bark of the trees where it has rubbed its antlers. In addition to the correct reading of the clues to the stag, Gaston also demands the secret observation of the animal itself. I quote him again. At dawn, he, the hunter in training, should endeavor to observe the animal with his own eyes, to see if he sees something he likes, in other words, a stag suitable for the hunt. To this end, he leaves his track dog someplace where the latter cannot cause a fright. He must go to a part of the forest where the trees are not high, or in any case to a place where he can see the stag, always making sure to stay downwind. He can climb the tree. That's what you see in the miniatures. He's not climbing a tree, but sitting behind a tree. And he can climb the tree so that the stag cannot get scent of him, and he can see the animal from farther away. End of quote. The miniatures illustrating the livre de chasse likewise convey that the hunter enters the animal's habitat, a habitat very different from the one we discussed 2 weeks ago, and that he must take special precautions there, but in turn will be rewarded with a look at the animal in its uniqueness. Quite unlike the case of the menagerie. There, the circumstances are reversed, as this drawing in a copy of Giovannino Macanova's Collectio Antiquitatum dating from the early 1470s shows. In the series of depictions of the art and architecture of ancient Rome, it shows a vivarium housing different animals. The viewer could stand comfortably at the viewing hatch and gaze in an ideal world at animals posing especially for him. It is by no means my intention to claim that the hunting context was exemplary and imperative for an artist like Pisanello in the sense that he emulated the hunter, stalked up on the animals in the forest at the break of dawn, and made his sketches there under precarious circumstances. To stick to the example of the stag, close-up views of the obviously alive animals suggest rather that the artist was working in a hunting park or reserve, a setting somewhere in between the wild and the menagerie where, to an extent, the animals could become accustomed to the presence of humans. What is important to me here is an overriding aspect. The hunting treatises point out that the hunt encouraged a knowledgeable understanding of the animal based on, among other things, the observation of the species as well as of individual specimens, their spores, their behavior, their appearance. Artists whose clients were passionate hunters will have had to deal with well-informed observers who may well have expected to see the specific traits of the respective animal in the artistic depiction of that animal. To my mind, the development of interest in animals thus came about in twofold dialogical manner, through the artists and through the hunters that constituted their public. The fact that a specific way of perceiving animals induced by hunting found its way into the drawings can be shown more specifically. Regardless of the form of hunting, the events of the hunt culminate in the encounter with the individual animal. Gaston Phébus never tires of emphasizing that the preliminary reconnaissance carried out by the young hunting helper served the purpose of choosing the suitable royal stag for the chase. The pack of hounds would hone in only on this animal. Yet also in the context of drives, a type of hunting in which several animals are scared up, the hunter ultimately finds himself face to face with the individual beast. According to the Livre de Chasse, the most desirable situation is to slay the animal from as close a distance as possible, because the hunter who risks this situation has to reckon with an attack. The hunt, to quote Marcel Thiebaud, meant movement toward conflict. End of quote. In general, the game is construed by the treatise as a veritable opponent. The challenges a hunter appreciates are twofold. On the one hand, the animal attacks, and on the other hand, it flees, exhibiting strength, stamina, and an inherent wisdom for which it deserves recognition. Even the wolf, which represents a danger to man and animal alike, is worthy of respect. I quote Gaston, "It is a marvelously clever beast, merveilleusement sachant best, more cunning than any other when it comes to maintaining its advantage, because it never puts more effort into fleeing than necessary, as it constantly seeks to preserve its strength and endurance." End of quote. Faster than the hounds and not afraid of attacking them, the wolf proves to be a combative opponent. This appreciation accounts for the fact that the wolf of all animals had been meticulously and time-consumingly depicted in the watercolor with densely placed light on dark brown lines. The comparison with the sheet on which the artist depicted no more than the head of a fallow deer in full detail reveals how much effort the detailed depiction required. The decision to show the wolf with open jaws must have been made consciously, because this jaw position would have had to be fixed with further aids, for example, small blocks of wood or rods. And I owe this insight to a taxidermist at the Museum of Natural History in Frankfurt. The attention was thus drawn to the wolf's powerful and deadly bite. According to Gaston Phébus, a further source of dread, but also one of the animal's special qualities. Unlike the wolf and every other animal depicted in this type of drawing, the wild sow in the lower half of the sheet has been placed in a surrounding composed of irregular, rapidly executed strokes, shaped in the denser areas together, undoubtedly intended to represent the ground the animal is standing on. Actually, however, they introduce a sense of agitation to the depiction, not interfering with the animal's stable stance, but serving to attribute additional agility to it. Like the wild boar, the wild sow was considered proud and dangerous, and fearless in its readiness to attack human beings, hounds, and other animals. With its uncontrolled hooks, the drawing restores this aspect of unpredictable boldness to the slain animal. Okay, I will switch to the next example. I don't know why the quality of this is not so good in this projection, but this is the sort of the original, and I manipulated it in order to bring out these heads better, but with this screen it doesn't work. The interest in the resistive animal is also mirrored in these drawings of the head of a pine marten. Hitherto consistently, it's the same heads in these drawings, hitherto consistently identified as a cat, evidently even by an artist in Pisanello's workshop who copied the heads and supplemented them with cat-like bodies. And I would not be able to identify the animal without, again, the help of the taxidermist and photographs. Since the poses of the heads correspond to the natural behavior of the pine marten, the drawings were presumably made after a living animal, possibly one held by another person. If the animal had been dead, the open mouth and pinned back ears would have had to be carefully fixed in place. Whereas in nature, the pine marten can by all means be perceived as pretty and cute, the drawings show an animal with threatening gestures and sharp teeth. The pine marten was also hunted in traps. It was coveted for its fur and loathed for being a honey thief, and it also defended itself. It is this last aspect that was decisive for the artist, who adhered to a perception of the animal from the hunter's perspective. As long as the animal is not domesticated, it seeks to avoid seizure by man, and to that end makes use of all the gifts with which it is endowed by nature. From this it follows that the resistivity of animals cannot be regarded as the general aim of animal depictions. Domestic animals are pictured differently and frequently express their willingness to serve by appearing with their accessories, in the case of hunting dogs and mules, the muzzle band, collar, hardness, or saddle. The cow is imposing by virtue of its bodily volume and resulting aura of sedateness. The strength and calm of the work or farm animal is far more important than the danger its horns can represent to man. As is shown not only by the drawings, but also by Pisanello's London panel of Saints Anthony and George, animals were perceived according to the uses assigned to them by man. The wild sow at Anthony's feet, here, with its dark brown hide, belongs as much to the dense forest as to the hermit. The horses, on the other hand, here, craning their richly decorated heads into the scene behind the splendidly attired George, are of a different world altogether, the world of the court. To my mind, it would thus be a mistake to want to identify a generally valid or even a scientific interest in the animal. To be sure, every animal was seen to possess a certain beauty. That is already evident, for example, in Marco Polo's late 13th century accounts of his travels when he raves about the Chinese yak, that it is so beautiful as to be a miracle, si beau que c'en est une voix à voir, or considered the humped cattle in Iran the most beautiful thing to be seen in this world, la plus belle chose du monde à voir. Naturally, there are also exceptions, such as the horrible crocodile, très hideuse chose, and the repulsive rhinoceros, très laide bête à voir. At the beginning of the 14th century, an entirely different type of text emphasizes not so much the beauty of animals as the pleasure that they provide, namely Pietro de Crescenzi's manual Successful Husbandry, Ruralia Commoda, completed between 1304 and 1309. As a supplement to the pleasure garden, Pietro recommends planting a forest to which the game kept in the pleasure garden can flee and where it can hide. A further piece of advice points to the enjoyment derived from observing the hares, stags, rabbits, and goats that are not to be disturbed by animals of prey. And I quote Pietro de Crescenzi, "The rows of trees in the park should be spaced widely so that the animals' activities, the Latin read quecunque agunt animalia, in the garden can be observed from the castle." End of quote. In conclusion, within the context of the hunt, the observation of animals was intensified and became an expectation that required knowledge, but from which further insights could also result. The attention was directed to the characteristic traits of the hunted species, as well as those of the individual animals suited to the purpose of the planned hunt. This animal was construed as a contender. It was distinguished by its natural ability to flee and defend itself, qualities which inspired appreciation in and commanded respect from every hunter, but which ultimately magnified the hunter's triumph. Court artists such as Giovannino de Grassi, Michelino da Besozzo, and Antonio Pisanello participated in this specific perception of animals. It was the perception that left the animals in the context of the use assigned to them by man and took equal pleasure in the domesticated, tame animal as in the wild, resistant one. It needs to be stressed, however, that this understanding of the artistic interest in animals seems first and foremost to apply to late 14th to mid-15th century Italy. It does not prepare the ground for yet another continuous history of naturalism in the arts. While the hunt remained a distinctive privilege of the nobility and a cherished pastime at those courts with which many Italian artists of the second half of the 15th century had close working relationships, Giovannino's and Pisanello's interest in nature had no immediate followers in Italy. One reason for this might be a change of media. As it seems, in the course of the 15th century, large-scale tapestry became the preferred type of object for the depiction of hunting scenes. In other words, the topic of the hunt was relegated to tapestry produced by specialized workshops not in Italy, but in France and the Netherlands. However, this hypothesis that naturalism is not only a context, but also media-specific mode needs further thinking and could be the topic of another lecture. Thank you.
Time for questions? Is there just one? I've got one to start. So I noticed, Katrin, that the images that we've seen are, and the references that you've made to other portrayals of the hunt, all come from somewhere or other in the elite culture of the time. I'm wondering if is there any sense at all of how the hunt was understood and perhaps represented from other points in the social spectrum? Because I know that historically it's been a process in which a lot of classes have participated, although not at a high, at a central level. And is there any way of putting these in a social context?
Well, I mean, there is this type of elite hunting, and there is hunting of the lower groups of society. But I think, as you know, it's only elite hunting that was a topic of the arts. It was very iconographically speaking, it was very important also to book illumination and the margins of books, manuscripts. There you have many hunting scenes, also hunting scenes with animals, like imitating the human hunters. But all this, I think, refers more to elite forms of hunting. I mean, and if it's not, then it's with these animals imitating human hunters. It's more sarcastic, more critique. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Any visual or conceptual kinship with the earlier medieval bestiaries, with all these mythological animals?
That's how, also these depictions of animals from the 15th century have so far been looked at. So, the bestiary is always concerned with symbolic meaning, allegorical meaning, but to my mind, from my point of view, in the aesthetics of these drawings, so much changes that there is no connection to the bestiary. And when you look at the bestiary manuscripts, the illumination in the manuscripts, it's so traditional. There is nothing really new going on also in these later medieval manuscripts. So, there's nothing in the drawings that, there are no features of the animals in the drawings that actually point to how these animals are discussed in the bestiary. I mean, I don't think that is there.
I've seen some of those Pisanello drawings before, and I have to say, it has never occurred to me before this that those animals were dead.
Oh, yeah.
And now, of course, I realize, yes, in order to draw an animal that well, there has to be a model. I get that. But I guess I have a couple of questions about the drawings and how you think that they were intended to be seen and received. I mean, they look like finished drawings, like small presentation drawings, rather than sketches that would be kept in the studio to help make a bigger picture. And do you think that there was some, do they gain any value or prestige if a viewer looks at them and thinks, yes, this is drawn from a specimen that's right in front of the artist? Right? Are they meant to look alive and fool me the way they fooled me, or do you think that they were meant to be seen by someone who, as a true specimen? I don't know if my question is making any sense.
Well, let's see. The corpus of the so-called Pisanello drawings in the Louvre is so big. There's so many drawings in this corpus and various types. So it's actually very difficult to attribute all of them to Pisanello. It doesn't make any sense. And I think, these highly finished drawings, like the one of the wolf, the what, so maybe it's not this particular drawing that goes back to the animal model, but it goes back to another drawing. So it's done after another drawing. The dead dog, though, is different.
Yes, I've never
Yeah.
seen that one.
You know, the one, that's different. I mean, so that's not so much finished. It's more, it's done quickly, and it's referring, I think, very much to the actual model. And you know, what I'm interested in, I'm now coming to the second part of your question. What I'm interested in is more in the practice of the artist. So I don't try to understand these animals from the point of view, from the question, is it convincing enough? What kind of aesthetic is it for the onlooker, but more from the practice of the artist. So I think it's just interesting that these animals are taken from a specific practice, and that, you know, the artists work with these models and the bodies. And it changes the whole procedure. It's so different from working from these models than copying another drawing. Yeah.
It's really fascinating to see how the quality of function and of the drawing and the finish really creates this kind of hierarchy. That I was really interested in you talking about how, you know, what gets the most attention are the animals that are the combatants. But I was also really struck by the observation that drawing animals is a challenge because they don't have the ideal proportions of a male human figure. And I'm wondering if part of the aim then in these drawings is about the production of a kind of ideal animal type, or setting a kind of template.
Well, again, I think it depends on which drawing which drawing we're talking about. I mean, again, the dog, surely not, because, you know, the body is in a way so twisted and it's lying so strange on the ground that it's difficult to make out any proportions or you know, aspects of the body. But the wild sow, definitely. And also this jumping hunting leopard reappears again and again. You can find this example also in book elimination, so that, you know, either somewhere there must have been in the whole process this animal model, but then from the drawing or from another, not really a painting, but maybe also book elimination, you know, they worked on these drawings and other paintings. So I think there is this idea about showing it, depicting it in an ideal way, and maybe this is also about proportions. So that the drawing is something where this ideal model is stored and can then be reused. But that's a very typical function of drawings anyway. So.
I'm aware that this question is not related to the way that these drawings fit into your work, but I'm questioning, or I'd like you to kind of put these into the sort of heart of the discourse on the development of naturalism. And when I'm looking at some of these, I'm thinking of Benozzo Gozzoli in 15th century Florence, and the Medici Chapel, for example, that has so many, you know, absolutely, you know, I think that this little, I'm so bad at animals, I'm embarrassed. Is this I don't know what this is, a leopard or a spotted small cat. Looks like it could be lifted almost from there, but the way that fresco, that kind of fresco cycle is discussed is never almost in terms of naturalism, that it's very much in terms of a kind of courtly aesthetic, that it is a sort of fairy tale land, that it is a kind of never land that is removed from this kind of Florentine naturalistic mode, and I'm wondering where it's kind of the humans versus the animals in some ways, you know, that Goetzeli is really representing animals in the most, you know, in terms of Florence, in the most kind of naturalistic way, or kind of in this specific mode, but it's not placed there historiographically. So I know that this isn't kind of in line probably with what you're thinking about, but I'm wondering how you think about the way looking at animals more carefully allows us to sort of restructure, you know, kind of the history of this development of naturalism, sort of at its kind of more canonical core, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it gets complicated, the history of the depiction of animals within the 15th century.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's only Pisanello and then there is Bellini, these two artists of whom we have a larger corpus of animal drawings. And when you compare them, they are so different from each other. So what Bellini does with these lion drawings and so on, is so different from what Pisanello in his workshop is interested in. And you know, they are so close by, they are so close to each other in terms of just chronology. And even there, you have this huge difference. And when you then come to the Goetzeli fresco, I think when you look at it more closely, and when you come from the Pisanello corpus, you realize that it's rather schematic. That the animals are shown in a rather schematic way. And there you seem to have a tendency that also occurs in the 15th century that, you know, after all these appropriations in a work such as Pisanello's, artists then turn again to more stiffened images. And you have this whole model book tradition really active in the second half of the 15th century. So this, that's why I tried to say at the end that this is just an episode.
Yeah.
And this is in a way difficult to understand.
No, it's really interesting. Would you mind talking for a minute about how it fits into your bigger project, this piece?
It doesn't. Yeah, I mean, in my project, I start with the silk patterns and I end with the silk patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So in the silk patterns, figurative imagery is very important in the 14th century, and the hunt becomes one of the main topics in textile pattern, figurative pattern. But this ends in the first half of the 15th century, and I'm interested why. Why does it? Why is there kind of a demise in textile pattern when at the same time artists, like high art artists, paintings, their drawings become interested in these objects? So there is an interest in these court cultures. I mean, the court was they were buying these silks. So, I mean, it's like a tendency that doesn't fit to the development of artists such as Pisanello. And that's what I'm interested in. And so I look, I try to make out what's the specific traits, what is at stake then in these drawings, what maybe in in textile pattern is not possible, and so that's why it shifts. So, but I don't reach the fresco itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking about ideal proportion and the sort of depiction of these animals as ideals. I'm really interested in the mirroring that I see between hunting as a practice of accruing really specific and esoteric information over time. And it's so specific, it's not sort of where do the deer live in the forest, but where do the deer live in this forest? Like where do I hide in the tree to see the deer? And this practice of drawing that seems so much about slow observation and very sort of accrued line making. And I'm really interested in the actual pace of drawing these things. Is there anything to be said for less about idealized depictions of animals and more about highly specific, sort of observed and meticulously copied depictions? Are there examples that have deformities or sort of real sort of distinct specificities?
Well, deformities, you can find them here. I mean, there aren't any drawings with more deformities than this. I mean, these highly finished drawings like this one, or these 3 ones, they are about haptic qualities too of the animal. I think that's right. But yeah, and they maybe, it's more probable that they are done after other drawings, that there was a first drawing of the animal model, and then this, with so much care, so much effort, that then the drawing was. I think in order to answer your question appropriately, one would have to show the whole spectrum of from this corpus. So detailed studies, the whole body of the animal, only in a sketch, and then in this finished form. So there are various kinds. It's very difficult to answer it with these examples.
I was actually fascinated with but that I came to realize, or you clearly showed us, that these highly, these animal depictions that are clearly supposed to be signaling an observation in nature, that they're actually most often then used in such highly ornamental final products like illuminated manuscripts. So, I mean, that, you have these paintings, these drawings that you so beautifully talk about, that are in some ways, completely at odds with the intense flatness of the ornament and the artificiality and the jewel-like quality of the illumination around the words. And and I'm sure you have, but can you talk a little bit more about how you've thought about this relationship between the seeming interest in naturalism and then the ornamentality
Of the book illuminations? Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the book illuminations, you would expect maybe that that's the place, that the image that goes with the text on the same page, that's the occasion to actually deal with the issues of the text. But the book illumination, the images in the manuscripts, they are how to describe that is difficult. They don't work with the potential of what is dealt with in the text.
Mm-hmm.
So you could, it's just as you described it. You can see it here. You have a beautiful scene, but look at the animals. Look at you have the ornamental background, and there's so much like more naturalistic features than in the drawings, but never in the manuscripts. And I think the reason for this is that the manuscripts, in order to produce such a manuscript, in most cases, the manuscript was copied from another manuscript, so that you have this tradition of images, of specific illuminations for this text, and there is sort of an iconographic tradition within the manuscripts. And at some points, the illuminators had like new clues, new ideas. Like, I love this figure here, the one hiding behind the tree. It's not, it's not this figure. But again, when you compare the animals, there is. It's not the content of the text, not the potential that is in the text. So that in a way that the images in the manuscripts are sort of disappointing. And yeah, I'm sorry, it's just difficult to describe at this point.
We have time for one final question.
Thank you, Katrin. That's lovely. I was really taken by one image that you haven't talked about during the Q&A session, so I wondered if we could go back to it. It's the painting with the...
Which one?
all tons and tons of animals in it. I think it was a Pisanello you told us? Yeah, this one? Yeah, right, okay. Because it got blended into the sequence with the manuscripts and the drawings, and it seems to me that this is quite a different animal. But maybe I'm wrong, so that's kind of what I wanted to know. Was it typical to have Christ so tiny, in the background? It seems like he's an excuse for this, this joyous depiction of the animal world. And what is he doing there, and how is that different from the...
But it's just the vision. That's the vision of Eustachius.
I'm sorry?
That's the vision of Eustachius. Eustachius, he's how do you pronounce this? Eustace. So that's him, and he's in the forest, and he's encountering a stag, and the stag then has this vision of the crucified Christ. So that it's part of the vision. That's how and then Christ on top of the head of the stag was talking to his usage, and so that's the encounter between these two. That's the topic. That's what the image shows. But you're absolutely right that all the surrounding is so there's so much more to see with all these hunting dogs and the animals in the background, and it's a very strange spatial construction, because it's very hard to see how big, for example, are the trees in this forest compared to the horse, and what's the distance between them here. So it's...
Well, so it goes back a little bit to Michael and Holly's question about, sorry, you can continue. I was just going to say, it goes back to your question a little bit about the allegorical versus the naturalist, the bestiary, and because this stag seems to me is functioning simultaneously as an allegorical figure, as a depiction of a text, right?
Mm-hmm.
And has allegorical significance in the text, but is also taking part in this experiment to see how many animals can be ranged inside of one single frame. So, yeah, and then a little rump up there, the two rumps of it really? I mean, it just seems to me like there's so much going on in here that you might enlarge the discussion. It seems like almost out of place in the series, in other words, that you're showing us.
Oh, so yeah, absolutely. Because I was, mainly looking at the drawings, and the connection made between the painting and the drawings is traditionally that the drawings were used, like, for the painting. I mean, like preparatory drawings, and that they were kept in order to be used in frescoes or deliver like motives for frescoes or paintings. And here, I mean, surely the stag was a symbol for Christ or the Christian, and of course, I mean, this is also part of the painting, but in the drawings where you don't have this reference to a specific vision, I don't think that there are these symbolic layers so evident. It's specific to this painting, and a very I think convincing interpretation is by Michael Baxendale of this painting, that he says this is an example that we can actually put in the context of humanist praise of Pisanello's work. So there is there's this forest, there are these many animals, so much more than we actually need in order to show this vision, because Pisanello knew that he had these specific admirers, humanist admirers, that were delighted to see nature depicted in a way that it addressed their senses. So that they could hear, they could feel, like the cold of the forest. They could hear the song of the birds and so on and so on. And also, Baxendale says that that might be the reason why the scroll here is without inscription, because humanist ekphrastic exercises were all about the production of new texts. So for them, then such a painting would be just an occasion in order to produce a new ekphrastic text. And that's maybe what he alludes to by, on the one hand, integrating a scroll that on the other hand, he doesn't use for an inscription. But that's just a suggestion by Baxendale. He is very cautious at this point.
Great, thank you very much, Katrin.
Thank you.
Next year's series, I hope more of them as well.
Likewise.